absolutely thrilled to have Mark West here with us tonight. I would like to say a few words about the Allen Lecture to begin with. Edward and Mary Allen have endowed this lecture here at MIT in the Department of Architecture in the hopes of bringing creative structural design to architecture, but also to cross-fertilize with engineering and other disciplines. And Edward and Mary are both distinguished educators themselves. Mary, longtime professor of biology at Wellesley, renowned for mentoring undergraduates in research at Wellesley. And Ed has taught internationally, but has been honored for lifetime contributions to architectural education with the Topaz Medallion, but was also on the MIT faculty for many years and on the Yale faculty for many years. And when I arrived at MIT about 13 years ago, Ed took me under his wing and showed me what it meant to teach, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. So I'm very indebted to Ed. And the exciting thing about this lecture is that every single year we get to bring an inspirational voice from somewhere in the world here to campus to work with students, and so we're really grateful to Edward and Mary for endowing this lecture for perpetuity. They are here. If you could please acknowledge their contribution to MIT. And tonight we're extraordinarily fortunate to hear from Mark West, an internationally renowned designer, builder, and educator who has really revolutionized the potential for forming concrete out of fabric in a remarkable way that is both artistic and yet deeply rational. And so I think you'll be excited about his work tonight, and I simply want to say that while his work has been honored with a number of international awards, such as a Wholesome Award and Sustainable Construction, he also is someone who has really inspired me and my students, and we've been showing his work here at MIT for decades as really introducing new potentials in concrete. And we're fortunate to have Mark at MIT for the semester, working in a workshop with students of both architecture and engineering, and that has been incredibly exciting and educational for all of us. So you're here to listen to Mark West and not to me. Please join me in welcoming Mark West for the 4th Allen Lecture.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Mary. Well, I'm very happy to be here teaching at MIT, and especially happy to be able to present something new to you this evening. The first part of this lecture will be a kind of recap of much the same material as I presented in my last lecture here, which is only 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago or something. That's just to bring everybody up to speed, those students who perhaps were not here at that time, but also as a way of introducing quite a different sort of lecture that I've never given before. So you'll be really the first to hear this lecture. Now, this is concrete as we know it. So I don't know about you, but I'm not terribly fond of that stuff. This is another kind of concrete. It's actually the same concrete, same kind of concrete, but in this case cast in a flexible fabric mold. So this is a flat sheet that's been crumpled. All of the concrete that I'll be showing you in this lecture is cast in flat sheets of fabric, not tailored, just flat sheets. So that's something that's important for you to know. I'm not going to go into technical details because there's a book that will be soon. In fact, next week they're typesetting the manuscript, so it will be out in the spring of next year. at the end of your academic year. It should be out if all goes well. So this book, it will be filled with all kinds of technical, it's a kind of how-to manual of all sorts of different techniques. And see that? You can do it. It's not so hard. It's actually pretty simple. Very simple techniques. And there's a chapter in there actually that is that Ed, Alan, and John wrote with me. I helped with a chapter as well. So the three of us are co-authors on one of the chapters on structural intelligence and flexible materials. There's also a history chapter. And so I thought I would just briefly run through, just so you know that the fabric formwork actually has a history. It's a very strange history, actually. So here's a patent by Gustav Lilienthal from 1899 for a floor system where the formwork is made out of paper. And he made quite a good living off of this invention when he was alive. There he is. His brother was also an inventor. He was racing the Wright brothers to be who would be the first to have a heavier than air flying machine. There's also James Waller, he was an Irish engineer, and he invented this system, which is the Ctesiphon system in mid-20th century. So here are parabolic arches and a fabric stretched between them and then covered with a thin layer of cement or cement-based, so like a mortar, let's say. And he built, I don't know how many thousands of square meters of space using this system. Very successful system. Large factories all over the world, storage, and it was mostly, there's some workers' housing he did, but mostly utilitarian buildings. This was the system adopted by Felix Candela for Felix Candela's very first thin shell vault. After that, of course, he went off and used other methods, but this was James Waller's method. There's also Miguel Fisac, the great Spanish architect, the late Miguel Fisac, who used flexible sheets of plastic for precasting wall panels, concrete wall panels, really we could say, an ornamented surface. Currently practicing in the field, let's say, the people who along with myself, well, here's the thing about fabric formwork. It's been invented, used, forgotten. Invented, used, forgotten. Invented, used, forgotten since the end of the 1800s. In the late 1980s, let's say, I discovered it. Of course, I thought I was the only one till I knew the history. Turns out Rick Fearon was doing it simultaneously, and he founded a company, Fab Form Industries, that produces commercial products for footing molds and also for columns. There's also Kenzo Uno, who simultaneously was inventing his own fabric-formed wall systems in Japan. He's an architect and builder in Japan. These incredibly beautiful concrete walls, very, very simple formworks. Look at that. There's almost nothing to the formwork. There's almost no material in that formwork at all. If you compare that to standard wall forms, you see there's something very special going on when you replace a rigid material with a flexible one. There's also Sandy Lawton, who runs a construction company in Waitsfield, Vermont. It's not the place where a lot of concrete gets built, but he's building, look at that thing. He's a small builder, but he got this job. He was a low bidder on this job because he could build this project without a crane. And that had to do with the extreme lightweight nature of the fabric molds that he was using. My own work in the field is deeply influenced by an art practice that involves drawings and sculptures. In fact, my quote-unquote discovery for myself came out of a sculptural practice. So from these graphite drawings into various concoctions of form work and so forth. This is part of my work, which I could say is different from my colleagues in the field. And also I was the only academic involved, so I had the great freedom of sharing what I'm obliged to share my work as an academic. And it's a great privilege to be able to do that, to not have to hold on to it in patented work or make it my bread and butter as a builder, for example. So that's been my role in the field. Now, the lithic fabric or lithic drapery has an ancient, ancient tradition, of course. And as we look at these Roman sculptures, we can also think back to the long, even more ancient, beyond history, the relationship between fabrics and the human body. It's as old as the hills. And of course, this textiles and architecture, which also probably go back to the very beginning of architecture and the very beginning of textiles. And for me, as a builder, I was a builder before I ever went to architecture school, and I'm still really a builder. These really inexpensive, cheap, powerful materials that are used every day in construction for scaffolding or for other purposes was a kind of dream that these could also be rigidified like a new kind of lithic drapery, but one connected to architecture at the scale of architecture. So either from drawings or collages, this is an active dreaming of a rigidified world of textile forms, let's say. Okay, so by playing with textiles, as these are some of my old students, and by rigidifying it, in this case by spraying plaster, which models spraying fiber-reinforced concrete, shotcrete, we discover these forms, these architectonic vocabulary that's unique to the materials involved. And they self-produce their own ornament as well. Remember, these are flat sheets, so the flat sheet decides how to buckle when it's pulled out of plane. There's a drawing of a mold for a curtain wall. And there's the mold being covered with a thin layer of shotcrete, about an inch thick. And that's the inch thick shell produced from that mold. You can hang the fabric differently to produce a different shell. These are deep structures because of the folding of the formwork membrane, but they're very thin. It's only about an inch thick in the center of it. The edges are thicker. This flat sheet could be deployed in a much simpler way, of course. In this case, it's in a project that I did with, it's Byung-Soo Cho architects in Korea. I didn't do the project with them. I gave them a method for doing these tilt-up walls. It's just they wanted these deeply folded tilt-up walls, so they're cast horizontally and lifted up onto the building. So those are plastic pipes, and the flat fabric sheet does the difficult part of making a continuous surface over those, what we call impactos, the technical word for those pipes. Those are impactos, or supactos if you want. So there's the building and a sort of detail of what those walls look like. Becomes more interesting when you allow the fabric to buckle in two directions. So if you take a piece of fabric and push it together along two axes, a flat sheet will spontaneously form a branching volume. And by guiding that branching volume in a rigid boundary, you can form all kinds of branching structures using flat sheet fabric molds. Or you could make a branching, radiating ribs out of a capital in a flat slab, as this model demonstrates. Push the flat sheet down into the mold to make the cap drop, and the radiating ribs form by themselves. Here's a more complex model of multiple capitals and a single sheet, where the radiating ribs that are naturally formed from the flat sheet might be arranged. You can draw, you imagine doing this with a piece of tracing paper like this, and you can draw the ribs in various directions as you wish. This is a plaster model made from a similar sort of device, you could say. There's a 1 to 10 model for a construction. The project was canceled, so we had the molds built, but they never got used. Or you can use the same branching method as the column to make branching beams and so forth. Another example of these branching columns. You can use the flat sheet to make branching ribs, in this case in a precast T-beam. Now, when you pour concrete into a permeable mold, the air bubbles bleed out through the skin of the mold, through the mold wall. So you don't have the problem of air bubbles on the surface finish. And some of the excess mixed water also bleeds out, which gives you a better concrete, a stronger concrete. And this is from a Masters of Engineering thesis done in University of Manitoba. So the vertical axis is strength, the horizontal axis is time. The black line is a concrete cylinder cast in a standard waterproof mold. And the red and green lines are two different geotextile fabrics that allow the mixed water to bleed through. So we see a 10%, approximately 10% increase in the strength of concrete cast in a permeable mold. Now, there are complexities to this, but the quality of the concrete at the surface of the cast, at the very least, can be much higher just by using a permeable mold. And the finish is spectacular. It's a kind of amazing, flawless finishes that we come to expect from permeable fabric molds. This is a drawing I did for to try to lay out the possibilities for a project in Culebra, Puerto Rico, for 13 site cast columns in a concrete villa there. And I flew to Culebra with all the molds for all of those columns and a few spares in my checked luggage. So the logistics, much like Sandy Lawton's project that he was able to do without a crane, I was able to do by flying the forms down in checked luggage. So it changes the logistics of construction tremendously when the molds can just be rolled up and so lightweight. You can use the thin flat sheet to form double curved shell shapes, as we're doing here. There's the proud team. The engineers in the audience will notice that we have it supported, right? Just like the diagram, friends. You can also form more complex shell shapes with the flat sheet, with a couple of tricks. So here's a design for what I call a flayed beam. So this is not really a compression shell, although there are compression shells in it, but it acts as a beam, which is to say it contains its own thrust. The shells are super efficient, but the support conditions, of course, you have to deal with the thrust somehow. So the beams are lovely because they exert no thrust on their supports. So the idea here is that on the straight horizontal portions of the shape is where the tension reinforcement goes. And the wings on either side, or maybe we should call them the hips of this thing, maybe wings or hips, are compression shells, funicular compression shells. So this is a kind of reduced schematic of how that would work. This is how the mold for this shell is made. And here's the shell itself coming off the mold. So the mold is hanging downwards, it's flipped over, so you get a pure funicular form generated by the gravity of the concrete on the mold. And then we have these compression shell flayed beams as the result. It's a structural design that's notional. It's not calculated other than by a kind of idea on first principles. It's the mold making that I'm involved in. You can also take a rectangular sheet, and by stretching it out or ruching it in, you can form variable section beams. So that's a rectangular sheet in a space between two tables, producing this bending moment shaped beam. And the rectangular block sketched in around it is indicating the notional concrete that might be saved by such a design. The idea is to only place material along the natural force paths of the structure. That's the flat sheet after it's been stripped from the body of the beam. That's $5 worth of material for the 5-meter beam. That's polypropylene geotextile. Here's a 12-meter beam. It's like a 40-foot beam. Again, a rectangular sheet of fabric to cast this bending moment shaped beam. So the bottom part of this photograph is a drawing of the bending moment mapped down onto the beam. Through this beam, actually, that I met Ed and John. This goes back a ways, this one. So the game would be to try to save this material by more intelligently placing the concrete. And if you can do that with a simple mold, so you're not spending a tremendous amount of money building a fancy pants mold, then that makes maybe the game worth playing. So we've experimented with any number of different kinds of beam shapes that can be made from simple fabric molds, and this has become the subject of engineering research at a number of different universities around the world. The devil is in the details, and there's much to learn about it because the behavior of these beams is not like a uniform section rectangular beam. Here's the crack pattern in one of these beams. This is let's say, an under-reinforced beam. And those of you in the know will see that this crack pattern is somewhat different than you might expect in a rectangular beam. The blue indicates the single strand of steel which is in this particular beam. So one strand of steel anchored at the ends of the beam. That's the beam, that beam, after testing, as it's come off the testing rig, and of course it's gone, right? Except it's not gone. You can put it back together again, and it will hold itself up. So as this gets loaded, that piece of steel in the bottom takes the tension, and the compression zone is now horizontal across the top of the beam. It's being squeezed back together again by its own load. So we made a beam that lived a life as a beam, we thought, and died as a beam, we thought, except it was resurrected as an arch, but a backwards arch. And maybe it was an arch all along, and we just thought it was a beam, but it was living the life of an arch. That leads us to the secret life of structures. Now, I'm going to read to you a very early structural text. This is by Leonardo da Vinci. who is trying to understand what a force is, something which remains mysterious, by the way, I would say, anyway. So this is from Leonardo's Hymn to Force. I don't know if he called it the Hymn to Force or whether that's how it got translated, but this is, I'll read you this. It's a series of fragments, let's say. Force is the same throughout, and the whole is in every part of it. Force is a spiritual power, an invisible energy, which is imparted by violence from without to all bodies out of their natural balance. That's Aristotelian physics, that one. Force is nothing but a spiritual power, an invisible energy which is created and communicated through violence from without by animated bodies to inanimated bodies, giving to these the similarity of life. And this life works in a marvelous way, compelling all created things from their places and changing their shapes. It speeds in fury to its undoing and continues to modify according to the occasion. Retardation strengthens it and speed weakens it. It lives by violence and dies through liberty. It transmutes and compels all bodies to a change of form and place. Great power gives it great desire for death. It drives away in its fury whatever stands in the way of its ruin. Wherever it is held, it is always ill at ease. It grows slowly from small beginnings to terrible and marvelous energy, and by compression of itself compels all things. It likes to consume itself. Force is but a desire to flight. It always wants to weaken and extinguish itself. When compressed, it compels all bodies. Without it, nothing moves. No sound or voice is heard without it. Its true source is in living bodies. Okay. I'm going to read to you now. So it was about 45 minutes of reading. Hope you, right? So get ready. This description or perception, when I say perception, I mean a theory, because it's a Greek word theory, really a kind of perception. Let's say a coherent perception. This description or perception of force, though thoroughly empirical, speaking of Leonardo, will be displaced by the mathematized world of Newtonian mechanics and statics. For Newton, his was still a spiritually charged world. Indeed, mathematics was his means of identifying deeper and even prophetic truths. Compared to Leonardo's world of thought and perception, however, our current systems of structural analysis and calculation, though very beautiful, have been dried out, as it were, by a fiercer objectivity. Tonight, I will put before you a strange composite of rationalized Newtonian theory and a Leonardo-like or Aristotelian empiricism. This theory, if we may call it such, is found in a curious manuscript that came into my possession through the estate of one of my aunts in 2005. In her personal effects was an old folio containing a perplexing document that had belonged to my great-great-aunt, Catherine Ragsdale. This document consists of 63 unbound handwritten pages, covered on both sides with blocks of fragmentary and condensed passages, in what appeared to be a coded text. The pages are undated, though given the fact that Catherine Ragsdale was born in 1920, I expect that these were written sometime in the mid to late 1800s in Edinburgh, Scotland, where the Ragsdales lived. And there's passages in it that are clearly from the late 1800s. Intrigued by these pages, I undertook the task of decoding and interpreting this text, which eventually required the assistance of colleagues in the University of Edinburgh School of Informatics, in particular Dr. Simon Tisdale, who was a postdoc there in cryptography at the time. So that's these guys. With their help, the task of breaking the code turned out to be a relatively simple task. The hardest part, and certainly the most time-consuming part, proved to be interpreting the handwriting itself, and this work fell to me. Remarkably, I soon discovered that the text was a treatise of sorts on structural behavior, a subject I was fairly well prepared to undertake and translate, in quotes. The author does not identify himself, but given the time period, I assumed that it was a man. In particular, it is most likely Catherine Ragsdale's older brother, the Reverend Clifford Ragsdale, an Episcopal minister who studied engineering and later theology at the University of Edinburgh. This, at least, is the closest I can come to identifying the author. The structural theory outlined in these pages is an unusual one. Let me move to this. It is an unusual one. The notes are almost entirely telegraphic, lacking full sentence structure or punctuation, as if constituting notes for some larger or later work. Consequently, for this lecture, I have heavily edited the original notes for narrative clarity and to render it more legible and accessible, without, I hope, erasing the author's original voice, such as it is. I've taken the title, The Secret Life of Structures, from one of these fragmentary passages. I've also taken the liberty of organizing the original fragments according to my own judgment into a sequence of headings, though the original text itself contains no such headings and no suggestion of its intended order or priority. This transcription, or translation, so to speak, is assembled and presented here with the hope that it will be received as the singular invention it purports to be. Speaking personally, what I found in these pages touched at the heart of the lessons I had been slowly learning over the years of working with flexible molds. It was as if these documents were giving voice to the world of structural possibilities that I had found through the plasticity and flexible tenacity of the materials themselves. The original pages contain no illustrations. For this lecture, I have supplied images that often include some of my own constructions and drawings. These, I hope, will provide a kind of parallel story to that of The Secret Life, which I will now read from. One, the Earth. The Earth is home to all material. Unlike matter, which exists universally, material is limited to a terrestrial existence that begins with its extraction from the Earth, our extraction and transformation of it from the Earth. When even the smallest quantity of matter is removed from the body of the Earth, it immediately feels an acute longing to return to it. This is why any material employed in a structure finds itself cast into a constant state of longing, manifest as an overwhelming desire to return to the ground. This longing causes every part of every structure to be locked into a perpetual state of arrested falling, just as the orbiting Earth itself is in a state of perpetual falling around its own origin, the sun. Because matter is the origin of all terrestrial force, both the structure's material and the forces engendered by it are, one through the other, longing for the same return. Indeed, this longing, this desire to fall, is the origin of force's possession of matter. Force is the actualization of matter's longing, its desire to fall. Two, the force-matter dyad. Okay, those of you for whom English may not be your best language, I'm sorry, but I'll just say that dyad is one thing which is two, or two things which is really one. So I don't know if there's other translations I'm going to have to make for some of you, but anyway, that's just so you understand what that is. All physical structures are composed of a twinning or a twining of force and matter. The true condition of their paired existence is this: there is no matter without force, and no force without matter. Any physical structure is a kind of knot where force and matter are folded around and within each other in mutual occupation. Matter is nothing more than a solidification of energy, and energy nothing more than an unfolding of matter into action. Even in their self-purified forms, one invisible and the other made flesh, matter and energy each remember the other as themselves. So although their terrestrial existence may be utterly different, they remain fundamentally cleaving, as it were, to each other. By their very nature, they are incapable of forgetting their essential mutual identity. This is why form is a consequence of action, and why only matter can carry force. It is said that matter dreams always of force, of its possession by force, while force dreams the counterpart of this desire, its saturation in matter, its possession of matter. Matter is the origin of all terrestrial force by serving as the body through which force, which has no body of its own, must live. Force originates in matter, hungers for matter as the means of its action in the world, and force is all action. In its terrestrial existence, matter displays itself in an exuberant exhibitionism. This unfolding of matter in its many forms and guises we call material. Just as material is a specific manifestation of matter, force is a specific manifestation of energy. Each manifestation of matter, in each of its material guises, presents a different origin, medium, mode, and means for force to exist. And each material likewise presents its own invitation and manner for force's possession of it. The world is composed of this vast variegation of matter in all its various material guises and of energy's complex manifestations given shape through the medium of material. The tension-compression dyad. Though the location of their Olympus is unknown, there are two cardinal and essential gods of force, named tension and compression. They live always together. One cannot exist without the other, though one may be dominant while the other follows secondarily. All forces, however, variously named, are constituted only by these two fundamental progenitors. Each is the mirroring opposite of the other in sense, and I believe that he means by direction, sense as direction. Each is the mirroring opposite of the other in sense, but of the two, tension is the purer, more angelic force, and compression the more corrupt. It's true, right? That's laughter recognizing a truth, I suppose. Compression carries within itself the weakness or fault of buckling. Like the corruption of sin, this weakness is inherent in it by virtue of its inward-facing sense. Tension is self-correcting towards purified forms. Tension is self-correcting towards purified forms of resistance, be it linear or funicular. Tension heals and purifies matter to the perfect form of its own production and delivery. The difference is evident from the behavior of matter when subjected to each. A bent rod will straighten by tension applied along its length, thus healing its damaged form by incrementally approaching the ideal straight line dictated for tension resistance. The same bent rod, however, will readily buckle and collapse at its bend when subjected to compression along its length. Buckling hides within compression itself a flaw that not even perfect symmetry herself can vanish. The creation of members or the call to structures. Call to structure. The creation of materials by their extraction and transformation from the earth simultaneously causes each material to be lifted into an exultant state of individual existence that springs from that material's discovery of its own individual properties, unique to itself and apart from all others. This self-knowledge constitutes a kind of intoxication and a consequent desire for action in the world. The transformation of universal matter into the specific differentiations embodied in each material kindles a material's private sense of its own potency and refines and characterizes specific states of longing and desire, as each finds its own capacities for its possession of force, its possession by force. The moment a dormant material is lifted from the ground, it awakens to a dawning sense of departure and individuation. What had been part of the whole is now parted from it. The yearning of matter for the earth and of the earth for the departed traces geometric arcs of desire through matter, precisely describing its intended fall back to earth. Through the exaltation that attends a material's discovery of its unique possession of force, a structural material will involuntarily resist this falling, transforming this longed-for trajectory into rivers of force, what the Reverend Ragsdale, if it is the Reverend Ragsdale, elsewhere calls a living self-expression through space. As force flows into the body of material, both material and force rediscover their primordial partnership and form an intimate bond through action in the world. In this way, separation from the earth initiates a material's calling to a life of structure. A material thus initiated into structural life is henceforth referred to as a member, and takes its stance among other members engaged in similar callings. The members' mutual sense of departure and longing induces a collective call and response between themselves and the earth. Although silent, this call and response chorus is nevertheless very real and is said to constitute a kind of silent moaning as the parted members seek through each other the ground they have left. The sound of this exchange, like all sound, is invisible because the voice given to matter is driven by force, and force, as we know, has no body of its own. However, visible evidence of these soundings may be found in certain subtle traces or geometric stains left in matter when it is flooded by force, arcs of desire, and a secret body of internal resistance. This calling of structural members is their way of bridging the distance opened up by their parting. We call this opened distance space, or more specifically, habitable space, as we ourselves, unlike other forms of matter, are limited to a life lived in a space in between structure. It can be rightfully said that our lives are lived between the silent call and response of the structural members that surround us and the earth from which they are extracted. 5, my failure is named my strength. With its capacity for action in the world, a structural material first confronts its inherent frailties as well, with a quickening self-knowledge of both power and weakness. Thus is produced an antagonistic sense of both exaltation and doubt. Exaltation from the discovery of the muscular potency that comes from being a structural member, and doubt, or fear, because with this potency comes a knowledge of the fall, that is, a felt knowledge of inherent physical limitations and the prospect of annihilation as a member through failure. This is the source of a deep ambivalence. Failure as a member, though feared as a sundering or cleavage of body, would result in the longed-for reunification or cleaving with the earth. It is because of this darker sense of ambivalence that we signify a material strength as its point of failure. You know this, like a steel, 60,000 PSI steel is named that because it fails at 60,000 PSI. So we signify material strength as its point of failure. As such, we also bespeak the contradictory and equivocal nature of a material's own self-regard. Such simultaneous and contradictory feelings are latent in all structural materials and profoundly color their behavior and their fate in the world. Understanding these conflicted states is key to understanding the interior life of matter. The relaxed state. A piece of material found lying on the ground exists in a profound state of indifference. Although force is always present in the body of any material, when both force and matter are in direct contact with the earth, for which they both long, we find them shrouded in a mutual dormancy. Their proximity to the earth is a kind of narcotic. Having fallen, as it were, as far as possible, matter and force are mutually discharged and as close to unconsciousness as possible. We can conjecture that there is in this state some sense of contentment, yet also perhaps of apathy or ennui. Here the only sign of life is a barely discernible and extremely slow breathing outwards and inwards in a lagging dimensional response to changes in ambient temperature. This is the dormant state of matter, and in this quiescent state, a material's energy is passive, sounding itself only in infinitesimal vibrations. In this state, we find only a shallow and sluggish thermal existence, where matter comes closest to fulfilling its desire for rest. This is called a relaxed state. In a relaxed state, matter's consciousness appears limited to a knowledge or a dream of its material boundaries. A material's latent ability for work lies dormant, and its fate to labor is obscured beyond the flat horizon of this limited existential condition. Some say that the only desire of a material in a relaxed state is to be left alone. Others say that this dormant state constitutes a kind of material limbo in which matter's true calling is obscured and obstructed by the narcotic fog of quiescence. 7, external forces. External forces, as the name suggests, are imposed on a structure or structural member from outside, either by the weight of other materials or objects, by wind, by the movement of the earth, the impact of projectiles, etc. These kinds of imposed loads are easily identified as external and require no further discussion. The weight of the structure or structural member itself, its dead weight, however, is also an external force. It may be surprising to learn that the weight of your arm does not properly belong to your arm. What you feel when you hold out your arm is in truth the earth's external call for its return. The weight you feel is not yours at all. Your arm's dead weight is an external force your body is unceasingly called to resist until its return to earth. It is the same for any structure. The origin of so-called self-weight is not internal, it is an imposed weight, originating from outside the structure itself. It is the calling of the earth, heard with an insinuated sense of selfness that belies its external origins. The proof of this is given by the fact that when a body is in a state of free fall, it becomes weightless. Internal forces. Still with me? Hope so. It's a lot of reading, I know. Internal forces are those generated by resistance to the call to return. The instinct or will to resist the call to return defines a material's structural capacity and character, its life as a member. The capacity to generate such an internal resistance originates in a material's individual self-knowledge and its exaltation in its capacity for action in the world. This structural instinct or will is directly and geometrically opposed to its own desire to return to a relaxed state, to fall, to fail, to relax. Each material generates its own kind or style of resistance depending on the virtues and weaknesses imparted to it in its extraction and creation from the earth. Some materials can only generate significant internal resistance through elongation and attenuation, while others can only do so through compaction and swelling. Still others are equally capable of resistance in both modes. These modes of resistance are the responses given to the call to structure. This call and response produces a harmonic effect, a kind of standing wave pattern generated by the external forces beckoning for a return to a relaxed state, a fall to earth, and the internally generated resisting response to this call, the exultant expression of a material's will or instinct for action in the world, its effortful struggle to maintain its own unique integrity, to resist its fated absorption back into the body of the earth. Nine, the internal soma of resistance. So soma is Greek for body. So soma is a body. Every structural material and every structural member is endowed not only with an involuntary reflex for resistance, but with an innate spatial intelligence as well. When subjected to an external force, a resisting member spontaneously acquires a three-dimensional pattern of mirrored resistance within itself. The form this pattern creates constitutes a dreamed of resisting body, living within the external shape of the member itself. This somatic shape of resistance is force dreaming its own body, invisibly, within the physical body of the member. This dreamed of shape is the closest shape to weightless falling that force can muster within a material body. This dreamed of body of internal resistance is called a resisting soma and corresponds to what matter itself hopes for as the least painful distribution of its suffering or stress under load. At the same time, this shape also corresponds to force's pitiless desire for the path of least resistance towards the earth. In this way, the shape of force's occupation of matter is that which will cause the least internal pain and which can be achieved with the least possible work. So these are, we could say, some of the stories that we tell about this invisible soma of resistance. These shapes haunt the body of structural members under load and are said to change their color or what amounts to color according to the level of pain induced within the material body of the member. If one internal pattern fails to provide resistance or the pain becomes too great, the resisting soma will shift within itself to an alternate shape of resistance until it finds the one pattern that best satisfies these desires. If a suitable shape for a resisting soma cannot be found within the body of the member, the structure will fail and fall. thus collapsing and convening both matter and force to the earth again. The reflexive adjustment of a material's pattern of internal resistance is as quick as thought, as fluid as dreaming. Its genius is marked by its rapidity and improvisational brilliance. Any thought or dream, however, still needs time to assemble itself, and this is why the speed with which an external force delivers itself to a structural member is so important. If a member is loaded slowly, or if the load upon it changes slowly, matter is given time to think, to try out a full repertoire of patterns for generating its dreamed-of body of internal resistance, and to shape new ones if necessary. If the load arrives quickly as an impact, there is less time for matter to think through its options. Thus, a sudden impact is more likely to cause failure. Shape and suffering. A change in applied external force will change not only the internal soma of resistance, but the global shape of the member itself, as the distances between its constituent particles change, the atoms. Any change in the external shape of the member will cause subsequent changes in the shape of the soma of resistance occupying that body. For the internal soma of resistance knows and responds to the shape of its material host. These two bodies, material and immaterial, produce a static structure only when they can find a mutually occupied space in which they may exist together, one within the other. In this way, force and matter can be said to shape each other in a constant adjustment to each other's bodies, both visible and invisible. A structural material, of necessity, holds an immaculate regard for its own shape. Every structural member holds a bodily memory of the original shape it held once in a relaxed state. Some say that the formation and shaping of an internal soma of resistance is equivalent to the member's attempt through a kind of geometric singing to remember its original shape, to bring its original shape back to itself. Others say that the formation of internal resistance is inherent to a warrior class of materials, a readiness to fight in the face of any disruption of its original shape. According to this view, a material's awakening to a call of structure is by definition a noble defensive act in the face of external aggression, a reflex for dimensional security that renounces any alteration in original shape. Still others say that shape change is inevitable in the face of any external force, and that there will always be external forces, and that all worthy structural materials accept this as their fate. According to this view, the provision of internal resistance is a natural response, achieved precisely by subtle, cunning, provisional, and proportional alterations in shape. We could call those strains. This provisional change of shape is not so much a surrender to external force as much as a way of embodying and subsuming an external force. Such resistance is achieved through a cunning accommodation, a cleverly negotiated acquiescence to a temporary, though fated, state of being. Still others say that structural materials metabolize external force into internal energy, what we would call strain energy. This metabolic capacity displays a secret and invisible transformative power to bring quiescent matter to consciousness, marking the beginning of a structural life, at once an internal awakening and a fulfillment through action in the world. However described, this fundamental spatializing relationship between force and matter is colored by the suffering of a structural member, the suffering a structural member is obliged to endure under extreme or highly concentrated loads, which taken to its extreme limits can lead to rupture. This suffering is called stress. The limit of a material's suffering before rupture is called its strength. Now, the text gets rather strange now, so jump off another ledge. Theories of time in static structures. Force has been understood since antiquity as the origin and cause of motion. Newton himself defined force precisely in terms of motion and change. Concurrently, motion is required for the marking and measuring of time. Some go so far as to say that time exists by virtue of motion in space. Thus, both force and time are joined, as it were, in what we may call the body of motion. In mechanisms, which is to say moving structures, this relationship is readily apparent through the physical induction through force of speed, velocity, and acceleration. Indeed, force may only be removed, as we may say, from matter by a state of free fall. In this condition, matter, which retains its mass, is found weightless. What such a forceless state requires is the motion peculiar to an unhindered return to earth, that is, a motion that has a falling shape. The erasure of force from matter through the motion of free fall leads us to the inverse proposition that the arrival of force in matter is the result of denying such motion to matter. Force enters matter when matter is held. Consider that while pulling an immovable object, a tension force is created. Allow that object to be released and to move freely, and the applied tension force disappears, transforming itself into motion. From this we see that a tension force is a pulling that does not come. Likewise, a compression force is a pushing that does not go, and a moment is a turning that does not rotate. Thus, all forces generated in a static structure are the direct issue of a stoppage of motion, which is to say, a stoppage of spatialized time. A held time is thus found enfolded and hidden within the forces coursing through every static structure. A static structure, by holding matter at a fixed distance from the earth, holds motion in a static state, thus producing forces and moments within the physical body. The resulting system produces both a held space, open for our purposes, and a held time, an invisible static falling, invisibly moving through the body of the structure. Thus, by the engineer's cunning disposition of matter in static equilibrium, both time and space are held open for our various purposes. Thus we have the theory of the abeyance of time in static structures, to wit, motion is spatialized time, motion arrested is spatialized time arrested. In this stoppage, force is held and felt by the static body of matter. Ergo, a static structure which stops motion by arresting the free fall of matter simultaneously arrests time. Mr. Muybridge's recent rapid shutter photographic cameras provide a worthy object of instruction in this regard. By giving us a vivid example of an infinitesimal stoppage of time holding fixed a dynamic motion. This is the graphic equivalent of a static structure. However, the simile only goes so far, as the photograph is merely an illusion, and no physical force is generated within the illusory body thus held. The theory of the abeyance of time in static structures is not, however, acceptable to all observers. For some, it is axiomatic that time must exist independent of matter or motion. The obvious yet problematic connections between force, motion, and time are, for these observers, resolved through an alternate theory called the theory of apparent stasis. This theory holds that stasis is itself illusory, and that all apparently static structures are, in fact, in another kind of motion. This illusion of stasis is the result of a phenomena that is the mirrored opposite of the illusion displayed in the spinning zoetrope or moving picture. In the moving picture, a multitude of sequenced static images produce the compelling illusion of motion through what is called a persistence of vision. In a so-called static structure, the inverse occurs, as a multitude of sequenced dynamic exchanges produces a compelling illusion of stasis. Some have said that the inability to perceive the active forces in a static structure is due to the inverse of persistence of vision, namely the non-persistence or cessation of vision. By light of this theory, the static structures which surround us are in fact seething with motion and dynamic exchanges, their apparent stillness a trick of perception. Nature, who hides her deepest secrets, keeps this motion hidden from view. The true dynamic nature of any static structure is discernible only to initiates of this deeper knowledge. And I think that Gaudí was one of the initiates of this deeper knowledge. This is a photograph taken from his studio in the Sagrada Familia, in the crypt of the Sagrada Familia. And these are plaster life casts. You know that the sculpture program, the Sagrada Familia, was generated from life casts of vegetables, plants, animals, human beings, and so forth. And the cherubs shown here are life casts taken from stillborn babies that were secreted to his studio from the hospitals in Barcelona at the time. So he was running a very serious studio. So we're nearing the end. As well as the subjects that I've presented here, The Secret Life of Structure treats many other subjects as well, with headings that I have called The Political Economy of Materials, The Futile Dream of an Ideal Shape, Shape and the Amelioration of Suffering, The Law of Structural Justice, Reports from the Infinitesimal, and The Vector's Deception, and others as well. So, inspired by the lessons of The Secret Life of Structures and wanting to leave you with something of a summation, my own summation of its lessons, I'll close with a short text of my own entitled Living and Inert Matter. There is no material difference between so-called living and dead or inert matter. Even the most dramatic differences between a living or non-living thing are not the result of any difference in the kind of material involved. The difference between a living and an inert thing is purely a question of how that matter, that same matter, is organized in time and space. When a living thing dies, its constituent molecules are not altered to a different kind of matter. There is only one kind of matter. There's nothing living inside a living cell. Every cell is composed of nothing but dead matter, molecules. The hydrogen and oxygen comprising the water inside your body are composed of precisely the same atoms found outside your body in the world. Indeed, The atoms in a living body are continually engaged in an unceasing exchange and circulation between so-called living and dead materials inside and outside the body, or the cells of your body. All materials, however named or thought of, are always in a state of prodigious, spontaneous activity. There is no dead matter. That's my lecture to you. So, that's the end. So, I hope there's some questions.
For questions or comments, we do ask you to use the mic if it's not giving feedback. And in deference to Reverend Ragsdale, questions with a Scottish accent are preferred. Questions or comments? Give us some time.
I think it's common, and I am Scottish, so.
That's perfect.
But I have to put on my Scottish accent because I speak normal in America. I was just interested that you thought it was written by a man because of the engineering thing. What was the education of your aunt? Do you know? Given that, I come from a long generation of professional women. So I just wondered if she went.
Quite difficult for me to answer that question. I would have to make up an answer.
Okay. No. Well, you
I would have to fabricate an answer, I could say. Right. Whoever wrote the text, I would feel confident was a man.
Okay. It's very poetic. That's if this is a straight translation, not a translation, but interpretation.
Well, I had a lot to do with writing it.
All right. Okay.
Questions, comments?
I mean, come on, did I put you to sleep? Could have put you to sleep, maybe. That's a possibility. I don't know. What do you think? Is it really?
There were some fantastic passages for me, but I'm more curious what you learned when you were putting this together from this work in relation to your current intrinsic and more scientific knowledge of structures versus your own artistic experience. And then, of course, obviously you have a large role in not fabricating, but, putting this together as a piece.
Well, it's been, when I had my first structures class in architecture school, because I had been in construction before that, I felt that the secrets of the universe were being revealed to me, And I don't think that all the students in my class felt that way. But perhaps because I had been struggling with matter on a daily basis as a builder, that it was like a revelation to me. These theories were very, very beautiful and clarifying for me about that. And so the text is an attempt to put what I knew bodily from working with material and in construction and making things with the structural theory that I've been taught and with Newtonian mechanics in general. And it was a question of putting this together in a way that made sense in an empirical way, but also in a way that made sense to me as a human being, if I could put it that way. Which is why the Leonardo text is so amazing. It was so amazing to me when I read the text. I said, oh, right. Because he's so clearly describing a force, but the way in which he was doing it was so utterly different from how it had been given to me in the structures classes, with the reduced as it was to a vector, let's say, and a quantity. I mean, you can go about design in a very cold-blooded way, but and things will work out for you. But I guess it's the sort of moisture and heat that I was looking for, and the moisture and heat that I had experienced, you know, from the concrete work, and the, you know, the bleeding of the molds and the tumescence of the forms and all of that stuff was quite like a living thing.
Since you mentioned structures class, do you think, you know, if you were to teach structures in only one semester, would you teach it differently for engineers and architects, or?
Well, I could only really teach it you know, I don't know. It's, I mean, I used to think, when I was taught that theory, I used to think that it was actually really true, like true in an absolute godly way, you know, that like, that vectors were real things. It was really, it's like a fundamentalist belief in the text that I had been given.
So you're saying you don't believe in vectors?
No, no. I mean, a vector is this terrible reduction. It's our admission that we don't really know what it is, but what we can handle this. It's like that's like all theological questions, like this problem of reduction into a concept. And so it's manageable. Once it's manageable in that state, then we can make the predictions and so forth. It's a very beautiful crystalline structure. But but you know, look at this. I mean, there's this for me is like a complete architecture lesson, and you know, and a lesson about matter in the world and time and all of it, mortality, all of it, and so I don't know. I'm not answering your question. I'm just drifting away for a moment. Would I teach it differently? Yeah, do you believe in vectors? That's like her kind of like. Good, that's very good.
Do I believe in vectors? Welcome to the debate. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. Sometimes a vector is very useful.
Right.
We agree.
He agreed. And the other thing is, you know what, the way that structural theory developed is through the limitations of drawing and calculation of the time. So they're done through two-dimensional sectional cuts through a full three-dimensional system. And I would say for like a four-dimensional system, but whatever. There's a reduction through these section cuts. But that's because we only now have three-dimensional virtual models with the computer. Before then, you could do a three-dimensional projection, which was nothing but an illusion. There was not a third dimension in the drawing. It was an illusion of a third dimension, an axonometric or perspective. So now we can draw in 3 dimensions, and we can model force flows in 3 dimensions, yet my intuition about structures is still stuck in how I understood it, how I learned how to do it in 2-dimensional section cuts. So you cut the 2-dimensional section and you draw the vectors and so forth, and it works. I mean, the system works, but it's not as full a picture of structures and force and matter and, you know, as we're capable, we should be capable now. And yet, I don't know, my feet are still stuck in clay. It's hard for me to intuit. When you ever seen these, optimization programs? That's why I put some of these topology optimization things up from my colleague, Mr. Sonnegaard in Denmark. And they're sort of like unexpected. They don't look like structure. They don't come out like frames. They're not producing a bunch of rectangular frames. They're not producing the shapes of the structures that we're used to. It looks much more like this, actually, kind of branching, weird. So I say, my intuition would not allow me to intuit that until I saw those things, until the three-dimensional, the capacity to draw or calculate in more than 2 dimensions arrived. Say again? In a finite element analysis? If you do it in 2 dimensions, but you can also build a 3-dimensional, can you not? Here we go.
As someone who has spent most of a long lifetime in my own personal study of structural behavior, I find that what you've read to us is 90% truth at least, probably more like 99. And it's a real inspiration for working with the shaping of structures. I think, however, that if I had learned this when I was a sophomore in college, I would have found it pretty tough going. I think there's a lot of understanding of life itself that's embodied in these writings that are much more apparent and easy to understand when you're old than when you're young. I've now had experience of both, and believe me, being young is much better.
When we believed in vectors, Ed.
Okay, one last question from Doug.
Thank you, Mark, for the fantastic lectures. But I think you investigate the structural framework and then the fabric framework to follow the force of gravity with the tension and compression. But as an architectural student, the students are designing the space out of column, floor, or wall. But I'm wondering what's your opinion about space? For example, the atmosphere of space or with the light?
Well, that's a hell of a question, Doc. Well, I really don't know how to answer it in the terms that you've asked it, in terms of space. That word is a problem. I have a problem. I'm not really sure. That can mean lots of different things. But if I could answer it, maybe answer it this way with this slide up here, that if we understand that the world is, here's an architecture that comes out of a deep, ancient animist tradition, where everything is alive. That's in the past maybe, but it's still present, certainly in the architecture. Traditional, in this case, it's Japanese architecture. My experience of traditional Japanese architecture when I was in it, physically in it, in Kyoto in my case, was that the job of the architecture or the work of the architecture was something very different from what we discuss in a school of architecture when we're talking about what a building should be or do. So here, generally speaking, correct me if I'm wrong, the conversation is mostly about what we want. I want to be comfortable, I would like to have this, or maybe it's about the user, which is horrible to think about yourself as a user. So you become a user, so there's a kind of efficiency of using something for some purpose, I'm not sure what, right? So there's either the user or this, what I would consider a juvenile self-centeredness about what I want. And we try to make the architecture serve us, servant and served. This tradition of architecture, and I would say an architecture that knows that it's alive, all of its material being is alive in a very real way. This architecture does something very, very different. And my experience was that it was an architecture that was showing you something. I'm there in this building, and the architecture is not about me, it's about the world. It's like showing me things. It's like, look. Oh, either showing me something or showing me my place. Maybe that's a spatial question, showing my place in the world at large. Now, that's a subtle difference, but absolutely powerful difference in how you would think about making architecture, the way you would do something, why you would do something, how you imagine. My conversation, if I could say, with the material world through these flexible materials, which are so responsive. It's not like working with a solid piece of material. Even solid pieces of material, not so solid, right? But it's harder to hear it, and when it's more solid, and it's much easier to get it when the thing is, clearly extending itself, like that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the fundamental reason, I think, why I ended up with this slide as for me, like sort of summation of the.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you. Aside from the poetry and the art of architecture, do you have a comment about what's being delivered today for our infrastructure, whether it be private or government, and the durability of it seems to me is extremely lacking. And I can give you 10,000 examples. One of them was just a few days ago, right at the intersection of Memorial Drive. But do you have any comment on that?
Well, yes. I think actually the question is very interesting to me because it makes me think that there's a chapter that should be written about architecture in time that has to do with durability. I mean, look, you guys know that I wrote The Secret Life of Structures, right? That's clear. I don't want to go out here like having pulled the wool over your eyes in some way. So it seems to me that this business of time in architecture extends also to exactly this question about durability. But that's a deep cultural, it's a deep cultural shift that, because an economy, let's say, is really nothing more than a cultural expression at some level. It would be unacceptable to have an economy that, that wasn't commensurate with a set of cultural requirements or desires. So we here live in a what I would consider a culture of excess, and it's a kind of this juvenile self-centered excess. I mean, I have a big problem. I have a big problem with my culture, huge problem with my culture, and this is one of its manifestations. And when you look at something, that's why one of the reasons why concrete is such an inferior material, unless you put it into compression. If you can put it into compression, it lasts a very, very long time. But otherwise, it falls apart, and you see a thing made out of stone. I mean, there are stone dry docks in Istanbul which are in perfect condition. Stone masonry dry docks are in perfect condition. They're used to this day. And then there's mid-20th century reinforced concrete dry docks that are just falling apart. They can't even use them. So the Ottomans built one. We built the other one. So there you go. But one is economical and the other one's not economical at the moment, right? So
I think it's a lack of pride in art production and the construction processes, not only the materials, but I see that as a moral complication, not an economic
Okay,
complication.
so this gentleman is saying that he sees it as a problem, a moral question centered around the question of pride, whether you have pride in the thing that you're making or not. That's very interesting. It's an interesting way to frame it. I have to think about that, but there may be something to it.
Maybe I'll jump in to say one of the goals of this lecture series is to help us discover ways to build better. And you certainly have inspired us tonight with both your invention as well as your views on structure and, quite frankly, your abilities as a performance artist. Please join me in thanking Mark West.